Chapter 11. The Spanish Conquest of the Americas, 16th century CE, Guns, Germs and Steel. The Spanish conquest of the Americas in the early 16th century is one of the most significant examples of how unequal access to technology can result in the collapse of entire civilizations. Within a few decades, the once thriving and highly organized empires of the Aztec and Inca were destroyed by a relatively small number of Spanish conquistadors. The factors that contributed to this conquest, often summarized by the phrase guns, germs and steel, underscore the devastating impact that technological disparities can have on societies. The Spanish possessed advanced weaponry, such as firearms and steel swords, along with horses that gave them unmatched mobility. These tools of warfare allowed the Spanish to overpower indigenous armies that were often more numerous, but far less equipped. At the same time, the introduction of Old World diseases, to which the indigenous populations had no immunity, decimated the Americas, further tipping the balance of power in favor of the Europeans. The combination of military technology, infectious diseases, and Spanish imperial tactics brought about the collapse of both the Aztec and Inca empires, reshaping the Americas and setting the stage for centuries of European colonization and exploitation. This chapter explores the conquest of the Americas through the lens of technological disparity, focusing on how Spanish advancements in military technology and their unwitting use of disease decimated indigenous populations. The consequences of this conquest serve as a powerful example of how unequal access to technology can create catastrophic inequalities, the effects of which still resonate in the modern world. The context: two great empires. Before the arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century, the Americas were home to advanced civilizations, particularly the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica and the Inca Empire in South America. These empires were highly organized, with complex political systems, monumental architecture, and sophisticated agriculture. The Aztec Empire, based in the Valley of Mexico, was a militaristic society that had expanded its influence over much of central Mexico. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, with a population of over 200,000. The city was a marvel of engineering, built on an island in a lake, and featuring elaborate causeways, canals, and aqueducts. The Aztecs had developed a highly organized system of agriculture, using chinampas, or floating gardens, to sustain their large population. Their empire was held together through a combination of military conquest and tribute from subject peoples. The Inca Empire, which stretched across much of western South America, was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. It was a highly centralized state, with its capital at Cusco in modern-day Peru. The Incas had developed advanced engineering techniques, including the construction of terraced agriculture and extensive road systems that connected their vast empire. They were skilled stoneworkers, as evidenced by the construction of sites like Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman. The empire was ruled by the Sapa Inca, who was considered semi-divine, and maintained control through a complex system of bureaucracy, redistribution of resources, and forced labor, known as the Mita system. Both the Aztec and Inca empires were highly organized, with sophisticated economies, military structures, and cultural traditions. However, they were also isolated from the technological advancements that had taken place in Eurasia, particularly the development of gunpowder weapons, steel, and the domestication of horses. This isolation would prove to be a fatal disadvantage when they encountered the Spanish conquistadors. Guns and steel, the technological advantage of the Spanish. When Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with around 600 men, his forces were vastly outnumbered by the Aztecs, whose armies could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors. Similarly, when Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru in 1532, his small force of fewer than 200 soldiers faced the might of the Inca Empire, which could command armies of thousands. Despite these overwhelming numerical disadvantages, the Spanish had one critical advantage: their technology. The Spanish were armed with steel swords, muskets, and crossbows, which were far more effective in battle than the weapons used by the indigenous forces. The Aztecs and Incas primarily fought with stone and obsidian weapons, such as clubs, spears, and arrows. While obsidian could be incredibly sharp, it was brittle and far less durable than steel. The Spanish rapiers, long slender swords, were capable of piercing the armor of indigenous warriors and inflicting devastating wounds. The arquebus, an early type of musket, gave the Spanish the ability to kill at a distance, though it was slow to reload and inaccurate by modern standards. The noise and smoke generated by the gunfire also had a profound psychological effect on the indigenous forces, many of whom had never seen or heard such weapons before. In addition to firearms, the Spanish used cannons, which could be devastating against large groups of soldiers or fortifications. The combination of steel weapons and firearms allowed the Spanish to cut through the ranks of indigenous warriors with relative ease, even when they were heavily outnumbered. Perhaps just as important as their weaponry were the horses the Spanish brought with them. Horses had been extinct in the Americas for millennia, and the indigenous populations had no experience with mounted warfare. The Spanish cavalry, though small in number, gave them a significant advantage in mobility and shock tactics. A charge by armored horsemen could scatter large formations of infantry, and the speed of their attacks allowed the Spanish to strike quickly and retreat before the enemy could organize a response. Horses were also a psychological weapon, as the Aztecs and Incas initially believed the horse and rider to be one creature, further increasing the mystique of Spanish invincibility. The Spanish also had access to steel armor, which protected them from the weapons used by indigenous forces, while the Aztecs and Incas wore quilted cotton armor, which provided some protection. It was no match for steel swords or the force of musket balls. The combination of offensive and defensive technology, firearms, steel swords, and armor, gave the Spanish a massive military advantage that helped compensate for their small numbers. Germs, the unintended weapon. While guns and steel gave the Spanish a critical advantage in battle, the most devastating weapon they brought to the Americas was one they did not intend to use: disease. The indigenous populations of the Americas had been isolated from the Old World for thousands of years, and as a result they had no immunity to diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, which were common in Europe, Asia, and Africa. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they unknowingly carried these diseases with them, and the effects were catastrophic. Smallpox in particular spread rapidly through indigenous populations, killing millions of people. In some regions, it is estimated that up to 90% of the population died from disease within a few decades of first contact with Europeans. The death toll from disease far exceeded the number of indigenous people killed in battle, and it fundamentally weakened the social and political structures of both the Aztec and Inca empires. In Mexico, a smallpox epidemic struck Tenochtitlan in 1520, just as Cortés and his forces were preparing to lay siege to the city. The disease killed tens of thousands of people, including the Aztec emperor Cuitlahuac, and left the city in disarray. The Aztecs were unable to mount an effective defense against the Spanish because so many of their warriors and leaders were either dead or incapacitated by disease. When Cortés launched his final assault on Tenochtitlan in 1521, the city fell relatively quickly, and with it the Aztec Empire. In the Inca Empire, smallpox arrived before the Spanish themselves, likely brought to the region by traders or other travelers. The epidemic spread rapidly through the Andes, killing the Inca emperor Huayna Capac and triggering a civil war between his sons Atahualpa and Huasca over the succession. This internal conflict severely weakened the empire, and when Pizarro arrived in 1532, he found a divided and demoralized state. Smallpox and other diseases continued to ravage the Inca population throughout the Spanish conquest, making it easier for the relatively small Spanish force to capture key cities and defeat the Inca armies. The role of disease in the conquest of the Americas cannot be overstated. Without the impact of smallpox and other epidemics, it is unlikely that the Spanish could have overthrown the Aztec and Inca empires with such relative ease. The biological isolation of the Americas had protected indigenous populations from many of the diseases that plagued the Old World, but it also left them vulnerable to these invisible invaders. The Spanish conquest was as much a biological event as it was a military one, with germs serving as one of the most effective and devastating tools of conquest. The fall of the Aztec and Inca empires. The fall of the Aztec Empire began when Cortés arrived on the Yucatan Peninsula in 1519. Initially, he formed alliances with indigenous groups who were resentful of Aztec domination and exploitation. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II invited Cortés into Tenochtitlan, believing the Spaniards might be divine or at least useful allies. However, tensions soon escalated and Cortés captured Moctezuma, using him as a puppet ruler. In 1520, a violent uprising forced the Spanish out of the city in an event known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, but they returned the following year with reinforcements. By this time, the smallpox epidemic had devastated the city and Cortés laid siege to Tenochtitlan. After months of fighting, the city fell in August 1521, and the Aztec Empire was effectively dismantled. The Spanish established New Spain on the ruins of the Aztec capital, and within a few years much of Mesoamerica was under Spanish control. The Inca Empire met a similar fate. Pizarro arrived in Peru in 1532, just as the empire was reeling from civil war and disease. He met with the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in the town of Cajamarca, where he captured him in a surprise attack. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Pizarro's small force of less than 200 men used their superior weapons and cavalry to defeat thousands of Inca soldiers in the Battle of Cajamarca. Atahualpa was later executed, and Pizarro marched on Cusco, the Inca capital, which fell in 1533. Although remnants of the Inca resistance continued to fight for several years, the empire had been fatally weakened. The Spanish established Lima as the capital of their new colony, Viceroyalty of Peru, and began the process of exploiting the empire's wealth, particularly its vast silver mines at Potosi. The consequences of technological inequality. The Spanish conquest of the Americas reshaped the global order, and it was made possible by the immense technological disparity between the European invaders and the indigenous populations. The Spanish used their superior weapons, horses, and military tactics to defeat larger armies, while diseases brought from Europe ravaged the indigenous populations. The collapse of the Aztec and Inca empires marked the beginning of centuries of European colonization and exploitation of the Americas, which had profound consequences for the global distribution of wealth and power. The conquest of the Americas led to the Columbian Exchange, a massive transfer of goods, people, and ideas between the Old and New Worlds. While the exchange brought new crops, animals, and technologies to both sides of the Atlantic, it also facilitated the exploitation of indigenous peoples and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. The wealth generated by the conquest, particularly from silver mines like those at Potosi, helped finance European expansion and laid the foundations for modern capitalism. At the same time, the indigenous populations of the Americas were subjected to brutal exploitation, forced labor, and cultural destruction. The encomenda system, established by the Spanish, effectively enslaved indigenous peoples, forcing them to work in mines and on plantations for the benefit of Spanish colonists. The long-term effects of this exploitation are still felt today, as many indigenous communities in Latin America continue to face economic and social marginalization. The Spanish conquest of the Americas serves as a powerful example of how unequal access to technology can lead to vast disparities in power and wealth. The technological advantage held by the Spanish allowed them to conquer and exploit entire civilizations, reshaping the Americas in ways that continue to reverberate through history. The lessons of this conquest are especially relevant today, as we enter the age of artificial intelligence, where the control of advanced technologies may once again create new forms of inequality and exploitation. In conclusion, the Spanish conquest of the Americas was a pivotal moment in world history, driven by a profound technological imbalance. The Spanish used their superior weapons, military tactics, and, unintentionally, the spread of disease to overthrow powerful empires like the Aztecs and Incas. This conquest set the stage for the European colonization of the Americas and the exploitation of its resources, with lasting consequences for global inequality. The events of the 16th century remind us that technological advancements are not neutral. They can be used to consolidate power, subjugate populations, and exploit resources. As we look to the